So apart from the legacy of the Roman Empire and the this institutional backdrop that was built and that was compounded over time, what role do you think geography played? Because there's been a lot of work by Jared Diamond and
Yeah.
Guns, Germs, and Seal and other works that talk about how this geographical benefit for arable land and temperate climate and all these variables that allowed uh, sedentary work to be created after the phase of hunter gathering and subsistence. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think Jared Diamond's sort of long-term view is absolutely correct. That Eurasia, and if you decide more like a Fertile Crescent, which is mostly Turkey, Iran, Middle East, had advantages that other areas didn't have, whether it was grass, whether it was, four key species of animals like goats and cows and horses, whatever it was, that other regions didn't have that. And at the same time, Eurasia is very sort of east to west. So it's easier to propagate it whenever you have, compared to very narrow channels like North America to South America or Africa. So you could see how it could propagate both the species, the agriculture, how it was easier to propagate literature, word of mouth, or anything else across Eurasia. And so longer term, he's absolutely right. The problem is when you start splitting it up a little bit and say, okay, I understand that, but why is North or West Europe, which was not part of any of that, today is much wealthier than Turkey or Egypt or Iraq? You can also debate the extent to which geography played a role in other places. So, for example, you could argue maybe landlocked countries can't really develop very well because there are huge transportation costs. They don't interact as well. But what about Switzerland? What about Botswana? What about Chile? Not landlocked, but a terrible geography. What about those countries? The same applies to sort of cocktail of diseases as well. That people will say, well, it's much harder to do it around tropical climate or equatorial climate. Look at Singapore, look at Malaysia, look at Dubai. So to me, I think geography does play a part. I think climatic conditions and the cocktail of diseases also plays a part. But to me, they're not the primary drivers. I do think that the primary drivers are institutional, they're cultural. One could debate the extent to which it becomes eventually genetic, and that's a completely total set of discussion. But to me, that's seemed to be much more powerful than blaming geography or climate or something else.
Yeah, that
Well, I
makes
think
sense.
you would have to agree that there's an interplay, right? I mean, certainly the fact that Northern Europeans extended their occupation into North America and therefore had access to a massive land and resource surplus in the presence of relatively scarce labor to develop that capital base
Right.
was a pretty substantial advantage. And then, of course, having North America isolated on both sides and therefore not nearly as susceptible to incursion. But you could say the same thing, I think, also about Russia and China in terms of land and
Correct.
resource surplus. So
Correct.
it wasn't
Correct.
exclusively land and resource surplus. You needed to combine land and resource surplus with labor scarcity and sort of a Western oriented value system and dynamism in institutions in order to facilitate make the most of that excess capital base.
And
Absolutely.
also, you're looking
Absolutely.
at Mexico and South America, like Mexico and the United States, incredibly close. You saw lots of land, lots of opportunities. But I remember reading a history book back in the day that showed that the way that they lured Europeans to North America was one of, this is a beautiful place. Artists come, Jesuits come. We'll bring you in with open arms. You can create your own future. Blah blah blah. The Spaniards, my people, the Peruvians, and a little bit of the Portuguese for Richard, who's Brazilian, were lured by gold. And the type of people that came is like, I will back you up. You will be part of the military. You can rape and pillage. Take the gold, bring it back, and if you decide to stay, you will be given a plot of land that you will rule over. So a
Extraction
very different
versus-
cultural and backing as to what type of people we attracted. And a lot of that, I think, the caudillo culture in South America is what continues to plague us today, in contrast to the United States and Canada.
Correct. I mean, you can compare Hong Kong and Macau, for example. One was a British settlement, the other one was a Portuguese settlement. And so you're absolutely right. It's a culture, it's institutional settings. Just promulgating or declaring a constitution and saying our constitution is the same as the United States means absolutely nothing. Because at the end of the day, societal norms are very, very different. And if they are different, you can proclaim whatever constitution you want. But at the end of the day, it's not going to function. I mean, the interesting thing, United States is one of the very few democracies that managed to maintain a presidential system. Usually presidential systems are susceptible to coups. They're susceptible to sort of garnering all of the power in the hands of one person. That's why almost all democracies have more Westminster parliamentary system rather than presidential system. So the interesting thing, U.S. actually somehow over the last couple of 100 years managed to keep a presidential system and at the same time keep democracy. But what you're discussing is absolutely right. Yes, climate has some impact. Yes, the climate, geography, ability to communicate across mountains, all of that has some impact. But at the end of the day, what those things do is accelerate or deaccelerate pre-existing conditions, pre-existing structures. I mean, one of the things my book is highlighting, China clearly was ahead of anybody back in 1300s. China was at the doorstep of industrial revolution. They had everything from moving print back way before Gutenberg. They had everything. They had paper. They could have gone into pretty much any area, and they didn't. And so the question is, why didn't they do it? Their coal mines had almost modern equipment. I mean, something that Europeans didn't get until 19th century, and that was 12 and 1300s. But it didn't happen. The same applies with Russia. Russia had tremendous iron ore resources in Ural Mountains. There was no coal, but there was plenty of charcoal you could have used. And then, of course, they had a coal and iron ore in Ukraine. And somehow either they're always too late or were too late, or alternative, they never quite got there. And so, to me, the institutional sort of reasons or cultural reasons are really so dominant that everything else can be overcome, I think.
Yeah, I think it makes sense that the driving force would be the cultural and institutional backdrop, but the geographical advantages would allow those to compound. And so
That's
it's
right.
what Adam was saying, that interplay is what allow that symbiosis between nature and then nurture to then create these societies. And to your point about the US, I think it has to do with the checks and balances that the founding fathers created, and the power of the Congress is second to none in presidential systems. I think the US Congress has a lot more teeth than other countries with presidential systems.
But you have to remember that if you think of Latin America in the 19th century, they pretty much adopted US Constitution. So what we see today in Latin America is just changes that occurred because societal norms were not in tune with the way Constitution was supposed to function. But to begin with, the differences actually were not that significant. Constitutions were almost the same.